directly in this amazing panel for this conversation. Thank you. Welcome.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's nice to be here. Great to have you. It's going to be an exciting conversation. I hope you'll find it valuable. Maybe we'll do a brief round of introductions, and then I'll kick it off with the conversation. So I'm Irakli Gabruashvili. I'm a partner in McKinsey. I serve large and small financial institutions across risk and resilience, technology enablement, and growth strategy topics.
Good. No, thank you, and thanks for coming into the session today. So I'm Lee Sucroft. I am COO and CFO of Thorn. We are a science-based, clinically efficacious supplement brand. So hopefully we have some Thorn users out in the crowd. Nice to meet you.
I am a Thorn user, Lee, so appreciate that. My name's Allison Stallo. I'm CFO of a company called Fundrise. We are a direct-to-consumer alternative asset manager. So retail, private markets, a lot of risk there. Before joining Fundrise, I was the chief accountant for the Division of Investment Management at the Securities and Exchange Commission. So deal with a lot of regulatory and risk around both my prior job and now at an asset manager.
Hello, I'm Doug Orsog. I'm Vice President of Business Transformation and Growth at OneStream. We're a CPM, corporate performance management software service provider. What I do and what my team does is we work with folks who are thinking about taking a journey with OneStream, well on their journey, deep into their journey, and help them understand what are those capabilities that we can bring to the table that make sure that we're fitting their needs.
Great. I'm Kyle Wisman, so I'm the CFO of XPO. So we're a less than truckload company in the US and then broader transport in Europe. So might not ship parcels for Christmas, but if you got any freight you want to move, let me know. Happy to help you guys out.
For a discount.
Better than FedEx, just for that.
Excellent. So before we dive into the conversation, let me tee this up and give you a bit of an intro of the themes that we will explore. So we'll focus on the idea that risk is not necessarily something to be minimized, but it's at the very center of delivering and driving competitive advantage. I think we all intuitively understand that. However, too many organizations treat risk as merely something to be managed away, a compliance exercise, and sometimes really isolated to and owned by a single function. What we see is the most successful institutions actually take a more integrated approach, and they embed risk as part of the business decisions and strategic decisions. And I would argue that the CFO sits at the very center of that integration, because every single consequential financial decision the CFO makes embeds kind of weighing upside against the downside, risk against the return. And this brings us to the crux of the notion that mastering resilience is really not just protecting the firm and protecting the downside. It's about how do we get ready, how do we prepare to capture the upside when the disruption creates the opportunity. All right. And in our work, we encounter, it's an important lesson, because in our work, we encounter kind of two failure modes sometimes, right? As if I had to describe the two archetypes, is there's archetype A, I would call them kind of risk agnostic operators, where basically businesses try to do everything to bypass, or frontline tries to bypass the risk considerations, and eventually issues catch up to them. And then there is kind of more of the risk-averse operators where the opposite is happening. The risk is acting as a blocker of almost every single exciting decision that cripples innovation and growth. And the reason none of these models work is that they fail to embed risk and kind of inform strategy with risk insights. And then one good example, which is very topical today, is the AI revolution and the technology revolution which is unfolding in front of us. And it takes, I think we all agree that the opportunity and the upside is tremendous. But in order to capture the value, it takes really much more nuanced consideration in terms of where we can invest, what are the workflows, what is the approach to reimagine that, and how do we protect against the downside, which is also pretty significant in the form of the data leakage or IP protection and the various technology and cyber considerations. And I would argue that the CFOs can help organizations maximize the risk-adjusted return, not only on just AI, but broader technology investments in terms of introducing the discipline of being kind of a capital allocation discipline and driving the resilient growth. So let me not belabor this point any further and kind of transition into our conversation with more concrete examples and more practical examples, hopefully. All right, so I would like to start with this notion as kind of as a CFO, delivering value for the enterprise means you are constantly evaluating the risk and return trade-offs across the multiple initiatives that you are pursuing, right? So I would like to ask you, how does risk enter that equation for you? And then more specifically, what does resilience mean for CFOs? And maybe we'll start with you, Lee, given you are sitting closest
Right.
from me.
Okay, look, I think all of us encounter risk every day, no matter what we do, and particularly when we think about the roles that we all play, it has to be top of mind. It's a little cliche to say risk is in everything. I look at risk as the cost of opportunity, meaning that if we are managing it well, we can harness risk and use that to do more. So when I think about how we manage it or how I manage it in the business, it does counter into every decision that we take. Now, we don't call risk out per se. If I think about the risk in running a brand campaign about a product format, but I expect risk to be a team sport in the business. It does not and it cannot just lie on the shoulders of the CFO. So when we think about doing basic things that most of us do, like a business risk assessment in terms of plotting things out on likelihood and value creation or value destruction, those are things that day in, day out that we do in our business. When I think about resilience, so resilience for me is a formula of financial durability plus operational flexibility and then strategic clarity. And if you have those three things working really well, and underneath each one of those three pillars, there's a lot that goes on with it. And the durability, could mean access to capital. The durability could mean in your P&L, if you're in the public market or the private market, the ability to withstand headwinds, if you will, in the market. Operational flexibility is regardless if you're a financial institution or like we are a manufacturer, the ability to make things happen. And using risk as I said earlier, a little bit more about an opportunity. My business today is private equity owned. So in comparison to maybe some of the other panelists up here with me, I have to think about things in a different way. And the risk is also about the time. So time of transaction versus where we are right now, time of capital that I'm going to put out versus right now. So it does factor into each one. And we do use the resilience little formula that I said to really think about and hone in on how risk can flip and turn into opportunity.
Allison, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you spot on everything that you just said. I think risk is opportunity. As an asset manager, we underwrite risk for, that's our business. So I think we definitely view risk as opportunity. And I think resilience is about, you said it well, but being in a position to take on the risks that you want to take on. And so a lot of those are structural, strong financial reporting, data integrity, controls, things like that. For us, it's liquidity discipline. Again, as an asset manager, I think aligned incentives with your customers is also really important in our business. So that, when we're making a decision in the face of risk, we can make a decision that's both best for the investor, our customer, and for the company. And then lastly, maybe a form of customer resilience is transparency with your customer. And so we spend a lot of time focused on communicating, even more than we have to with our investors, so that we build that brand loyalty.
That's great. So actually, something you said really struck with me, right? So the resilience is financial durability, operational flexibility, and the strategic clarity. On the strategic clarity point, I think it really resonates well with what I have seen in terms of resilience being defined, and then the kind of the healthy approach to resilience being defined as not just withstanding the shocks, but also that notion of taking advantage of the disruption. I wonder if you guys could share a few examples where you have actually lived that in practice and how that framing has helped kind of unlock some of the value creation in the context of the strategic decisions that you've been making. Maybe we'll start with Kyle this time.
Yeah, we'd be happy to contribute on this. So when you think about disruption, you know, I'm in the less than truckload space when trucking. So in 2023, Yellow, which is one of the major competitors in the space, went bankrupt. So when that happens, and there's that kind of dislocation in the market, obviously there's a capacity crunch. So 10% of capacity went out immediately. So when we were thinking about that, obviously you want to service your customers to the extent you can. But what we really ended up doing is thinking a little different about how we could take advantage of that opportunity. What we ended up doing is actually acquiring 28 different locations from Yellow to really build out our own network. So that actually added about 16% capacity to our network. Now, when you're buying assets from a bankrupt company, obviously there's risk involved, right? You don't know the full nature of those assets, and certainly it ended up costing us more than we initially thought. But when you think about the long-term help this can provide for us, it was a huge advantage for us from a service standpoint, because if I can add that kind of capacity close to my customers, there's real value there. And I think the other piece of this, not just service that you provide, but also the amount of capacity you really have that can be latent at times. And certainly, we're not in a really strong market right now, so something that's latent now, but we know the future stream that can come from that can be really impactful to the organization. And you got to balance that, because you think about a transaction that size, I mean, we end up spending $870 million. That's why I'm bald now. Kidding. Happened long before that. But when you're adding that amount of leverage, you really got to think about what it's going to do for the business longer term. And I think in this kind of case, this opportunity presented itself, and for us, we think it's transformative, right? These are assets that I couldn't build a trucking terminal in these locations because Yellow built them 100 years ago. So with us, we had to balance that risk, and we thought for a longer term standpoint, it made a lot of sense for us as a company to really think about that and opportunistically purchase those assets.
Yeah, I think embedded also in that comment is that you have to be continuously monitoring the environment and be ready to quickly make the decision when the opportunities present themselves. Doug, do you have, I know you had other great examples of this, and I was wondering if you wanted to share.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm not going to pick on you, Kyle.
You can.
Well, not exclusively.
Okay, good.
No, it's interesting. You listen to Kyle and you think about what the decisions he's talking about. These aren't necessarily financial decisions. These are operational decisions. And so what we've seen is the evolution of what the office of the CFO, what finance is responsible for, has evolved from finance. And, I think that we were talking the other day, and, what about your risk management company? Well, the risk management company is right there. Your risk management function is the office of the CFO. So the office of the CFO has always been responsible for that durable information, your financial information, the stuff you have to have on a day-to-day basis from a transactional information. More and more, what we see is they're accountable for the operational information. They have to produce the KPIs. You don't have operations doing financial KPIs. You have finance doing operational KPIs. Everything flows through the Office of Finance. And so that risk management function it's not a question of if, it just is. And so when I see folks answer questions like Kyle did, it's like, yes, I hear this 400 times. I've heard this 1,000 times. It's not even a question of if, it just happens. It is. And it's expected. And so you have to have that in your toolkit. It's no longer good enough to just be good at managing money. In fact, one thing the last decade did, up until about a few years ago when we had 0% interest rates, is the whole idea of managing money, that went out the door. That's an expectation. Your core stuff, you're still expected to do the core stuff. But more and more, the operational information, operational data is flowing through the office of the CFO. So that's what we're seeing more and more.
Great. If I just have to pull more on this thread of disruption, right? I cannot not ask a question about the AI, right? This is obviously a huge wave of disruption. A lot of the existing and established business models are being threatened. It's eroding the existing moats, right? So I was just curious, but so there's not an option to just sit still, right, and not do anything. So I was just curious, as CFOs, how are you engaging and helping your organizations shape this, not only strategy about AI, but maybe the framework around the capital allocation and the financial discipline around those types of investments? Lee, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, no, I'll clearly start. One of the things that we're not doing, and maybe I should have done, was tell my company to invest in NVIDIA, so that that would have been the best thing I probably could have done. Look, AI is something that it would be a risk, not to embrace it. In every company, AI means something slightly different. At Thorn, we are a supplement company who are doing a lot with AI today. So when I think about AI, if you went onto our site, you can see some AI engine. You can put in my joints ache and what should I take, but we can't tell you what to take because there's regulations, about that. So when I think about how we're using AI to connect with the consumer is really what we're thinking about. So, the risk in connecting with the consumer and bringing in more consumer data that perhaps are things that, it's not only PI data and how we store it, but things that we're asking for the consumer in order to run our business, we're getting from AI. Having product recommendations that might not be the right thing to do, and do we have the trust in those recommendations? So when we think about AI in terms of how we connect with the consumer differently is one area that we're looking at it. The other area, as we think about it, I was talking with Doug earlier this morning, how do I close my record to report cycle, in 2 to 3 days shorter, 4 days shorter, and how do I use AI and agentic AI to go do that? Now, there's risk on putting it out there when we think about data and data security. So when we think about AI inside of Thorn, we're thinking about it not only in finance, we're thinking about it in every function in the business, and we are putting some, what I would call it, guardrails out there about how to use it. I think that one of the things right now, when we think about everybody wants to use ChatGPT for something on their own, we've entered into, the enterprise versions, but putting guardrails and rules around it. And in some places, the way that we've done it, we have a 10-lane highway. Other places, we have a 1-lane highway. So, the thought about AI and the thought about risk, we are aware of what we're aware of today, but we're also looking at how do we work with our partners in a different way to understand how they think about risk as well on how they use AI. So it's certainly important. We've not cracked the code yet, solved it, but one of the real interesting things that we're looking at within the business.
That holistic enterprise-wide approach is extremely important. Alison, curious of your perspective as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, that all resonates with me. I think maybe 2 principles that I would layer on that we think about when we're adopting AI are, first, you have to constantly reevaluate the playbook because it's changing, by the second. And so something that works today is probably not going to work tomorrow. So you have to constantly be thinking about what's new, what's coming out, what new risks are being presented, and how you should respond to those. And then secondly, we focus a lot on the accountability of whatever model we're using, not just the autonomy. And so making sure that you're whatever you're building or buying, you're prioritizing what creates the most reliable outcome. And so a couple examples, I know Lee and I were talking about, we both have a customer service AI bot, and there's different risks presented by that, but generally low risk. For us, it's been really successful. We have almost 2 million members, and they ask basically the same question over and over and over again. And so that AI bot, can take a lot of burden off of the team.
Can you share what the question is?
Oh,
Just curious.
Honestly, a lot of times it's how do I log in, or
Interesting.
We've also used it as a first pair of eyes on marketing compliance reviews. So kind of before legal gets to it, someone, an AI bot is actually taking a stab at identifying what risks might present. And these are all really low judgment areas. And so I think, low risk, kind of low reward. It is clearing up a lot of administrative burden for our teams, but it's not huge outputs. We are thinking about some more judgmental areas. We've built an in-house real estate underwriting AI tool. That obviously is a lot of judgment. You really want to make sure that you're showing your work, and that's been important in our build. It's both for internal use and it will be a SaaS product. So we're very focused on the accountability of that tool.
Yeah. And Doug, I know you were excited about this topic as well. Is anything you want to add?
Very excited, very excited. So I'm going to talk specifically about within the office of the CFO. So, you know, there's people talk about an AI bubble. The AI bubble in office of the CFO is IT with the AI bubble wrap. They're going to put bubble wrap around what you can and can't do. And so there's really two different risks here. One leads to the other. The first is on the data security. We cannot have our information leaving the premises and somebody else learning on it. We got to keep control of that. The flip side is, and sometimes this prevents us from maximizing our capabilities and creates another risk, is really that risk of missing out, because this technology is transformative and other folks are using it. So how are they using it, and how are they using it in a way that's, if not risk averse, at least doesn't create other risks? So what I see folks doing, and Lee, you touched on this a little bit, it's got to be more of a, rather than a large language model, we need to have an enterprise language model. Let's digitize everything within the enterprise, bring in what we want to bring, but put a Chinese wall out there so stuff is not leaving. Have it within our applications, have it within our workflows. And that's where we see success. Where we see success is, it doesn't start with, hey, let's adopt AI. You heard two use cases. Let's start with a use case. That use case, what problem are we trying to solve? It's got to be within, we got to have it within the workflow. And we really got to make sure that the data we're using is unified, that it's not coming from all over the place. Lee and I were talking a little bit earlier about agents, and just refer back to the conversation. You can't go out there and say, hey, build this and get AR and AP data when you're just looking for AP data. You know, you have to be able to get the information you want. So there's a little bit of competency on training your people. I'm going to use the word. Everyone's got to be a semiotician. Does anyone know what the word means? Language, how you talk. So you think about it, finance is so oftentimes we're solving math problems. Really now it's going to be, how do we speak and how do we query? And a lot of what we do going forward is going to be based on that. So the two risks we're trying to mitigate here, the first is the data security risk. We got to have that enterprise language model. We got to have everything protected inside. It's got to be within workflows. And the other is, we got to get going, but we can't just jump into it. We don't want to miss out, but we got to have our use case, not somebody else's use case. So that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, can I just add one thing? So, you know, Doug, I like the enterprise, you know, piece of it, and AI can not only be finance, it can not only be IT, it's got to be across the business. And
Yep.
I think that, you know, the comments that you make around that, I think, are really valid in terms of how you think about it across the enterprise, not just in, you know, where you started the office of the CFO.
Yeah, and it's, although it does fall on us, the people at this table, just like any kind of risk mitigation seems to, since we have the biggest data sets, and since we also have access to operational data sets, if we're not the ones making the decision on AI, we're going to be left behind.
Yeah, I think just to contribute one other angle on this too, when you think about AI, I mean, I think we talk about the asset bubble at times, and I think part of the asset bubble that I think about, and certainly I think we do in our seats, is that it has to have a return on it, right? There's so much investment, you have to get cash for what you're putting out. So I think part of also where you think and how you actually apply AI for us, you know, we have, you know, most of my variable expense is all labor. Right? So we initially invested heavily in, we call it line haul, but effectively what that is moving between our sites, customers' freight, right? That's $1.6 billion of spend a year for us. So we used AI to help us find more efficient ways to route that and actually build loads within trailers. That's kind of low-hanging fruit. Like when you think about the cost aspect that we can all think about, whether you think customer service, whether you think about that side, the other piece of this are the more complex problems you can try to solve, things like pricing. So we're actually investing in trying to understand how I can do contract pricing through AI. And in my world, you know, a given quote might end up having thousands of lanes on it across the US. And if I have a pricing analyst looking and evaluating on a lane-by-lane basis for a quote, they might get the top 20 we carry today or the top 20 that the customer has. But something like AI can help ensure that every lane is optimized. So there's huge applications, but I think that the difficulty is that when you start attacking those types of problems, it's going to take longer to iterate and find the right solution for us. But I think, for me, I think a lot of it, when we think about risk too, we got to have it, there has to be a reward, there has to be cash coming from that, otherwise we're all going to face issues later on.
Absolutely. I think one common thread in your responses is that being a successful risk manager and being able to properly weigh the return against the exposure is thinking about the future and what can happen, right? But we also cannot foresee everything, right? So the important aspect of it is how do we prepare for unexpected, right? And many organizations yet choose not to talk about the unpleasant outcomes and negative outcomes and focus on the positive. So I was just curious from your perspective, kind of how do you plan for the kind of what if scenarios and how do you approach that? Maybe we'll start with Lee.
Yeah, so, every, decision I think about and look at is what are the intended consequences of where you want to go and what are the unintended consequences of decision-making. Another way to look at it, and many of us probably use it here on the table and in the audience, is about how do you think about pre-mortems before you actually do things to make sure you can cycle through on, what can happen and why, and really surround decisions you're making, with those types of things to look at the cost of a choice and how you think about, different routes that you may want to take. In my business and those of you that have maybe worked with PE firms, I love optionality. So having all this optionality in terms of a what if is really important. So if we go down this road, what if this happens or what if, and it's not necessarily options theory, but in a, consumer goods company like, Thorne, we look at things, do we want to play in women's health? And if we do, on how deep, and what if, it doesn't work out, not only about what do you have in stock cover, but, are you going to tarnish the consumer brands? And, each one of those what ifs, come back around when we think about the basics of business planning. The office of the CFO should be asking the question on how are you thinking about that decision? Help me understand what other options have you put out there? And one of the things that I'll say in my desk quite a bit, I'm not looking for a 10-page deck to justify what you're doing, but how are you thinking about the inside environment, the outside environment, the customer, and surrounding what's really important? And lastly, what's the rubric to the decision-making you're taking? So if you really understand how the decision is going to be evaluated, you can start thinking about these what-ifs, way up front rather than in the end.
Do any of you guys do pre-mortems before big initiatives and projects and go through like what can go wrong and this is how we prepare for that scenario? Yeah. Doug, it seems like you are,
That's kind of my job. What we do is we'll go in and, somebody like Lee maybe is looking at what is that rubric? Mm-hmm. And, folks think about what they're trying to accomplish. And a lot of what they're trying to accomplish is based on what they've done before. And so part of what we try to help them do is imagine what else. You're oftentimes, hey, we do this way today, and oftentimes you do it this way today because of the systems you had, the people you had, the intellectual property in people's heads that you had, because somebody created a really cool Excel model that explained it, and that's why we do it that way. So part of what we try to do is, before you even think about what that rubric is, let's take a step back and what are those questions you need to ask to put in there. And when we think about that, how do we design? We want to think about, going back to the original question, define different scenarios. There's a really cool technology I find a lot of people use for that. It's called Excel. And the problem is there's no connection. And, I guess I won't ask for a show of hands because I'm afraid what I'd see. Long-range plan. Everyone does a long-range plan. Oftentimes it's done in Excel, in a PowerPoint, and if you have different scenarios, you have this PowerPoint, this PowerPoint, this PowerPoint, or there are different tabs in the Excel. How about having a long-range plan, systemic, that feeds your budget, that's driver-based, that you can toggle off of that and say, listen, if this happens, then we have this. And it's not just for operational, it's also the capital decisions we're making, because we make those capital decisions today. Is that something we need next year? Is that still part of the long-range plan? How is that going? We need to factor that in to our budget next year, so if it's part of our 5-year plan, maybe we still have it. And the final thing is, if we're going to forecast, which is, updating the budget when we realize after month 1 it's wrong, is we have to be able to have that as part of that system as well. And if we're pulling in our actuals, which are driving this, and it's all driver-based, that's what we're trying to get to. But before we get there, to your term, I like the pre-mortem, we'll start calling ourselves the pre-morticians, is try to understand what are the problems you're going to have, and how do we anticipate that and make sure that you have what you need to make those decisions once those decisions need to be made.
Right. And just a follow-up question, like where do you, I guess the biggest driver, right, of this, for this exercise to be helpful, you need to source the ideas, right? You need to source what could go wrong type of things from various stakeholders. Like how do you approach that? Like who do you ask? Like what's the process?
I have a couple of thoughts on process broadly. I think a couple of things. We like to start at the end. So what are we trying to achieve?
The outcome,
And then
yeah.
work backwards. And then we also like to do both the top-down and bottom-ups approach to analyzing what could go wrong. I think when you do that, a lot of the key assumptions you're making that may not have been obvious to you at the beginning become more obvious. And you can start to see where those might go wrong. And basically, you can go through a process step by step to assume everything breaks that isn't in your control. And how can you still achieve what you want to achieve if all of those things happen?
Now, this you may not want to share, so you tell me if you don't want to answer this question, but through these exercises, did you have, like, what was the kind of an interesting scenario that bubbled up that you hadn't considered before and you found that insightful, like worst case outcome, which changed the kind of course of action? Is there anything like that?
I can share something. So if you think about like this year and kind of starting this year, it illustrates, I think, some of the points Doug was making, which is really that, forecasting and budgeting, they need to be living documents. I mean, I actually was a little surprised by the discussion this morning because I don't think a budget's good after 3 months. Like I've never been in that scenario. I think a budget's dead like the second week you do it. Like it's you use it to help just put in there and get, maybe help build some notion around what the total year targets are or consensus and things like that. But then you have to move off and make it a living document. And I give you an example from my space this year. When we came into the year in the transport space, in the broad transport space, we thought it could be in an environment where maybe there's some growth in tonnage. And certainly in transportation, we reflect what everyone else is doing, right? If the industrials aren't producing, we're not going to move it, obviously. If retail isn't buying as much, we're not going to move as much. So the prevailing logic in the broader space was probably a flat to maybe slightly positive environment. And lo and behold, as we work through this year, across the LTL space, you're down mid-single to high single digits, which just illustrates the fact that unless you're iterating all the time through your forecasting scenarios and you have the contingency plans needed, you'll ultimately fail. Right? Yeah. And for us, we've been able to improve our margin rates throughout the whole year. And the reason we're able to do that, even though tonnage is challenged, is because we have contingency plans and we know if certain things happen, you can go through. But I think as a finance team, what we need to do is really source the narratives and the ideas to do that, to find offsets, to understand what the levers are with the broader team. So it can't be relying on the FP&A teams. It can't be relying on the controllership team saying, all right, this went wrong. Let's harvest X or Y. It's got to be much more about what operationally do we need to do differently, knowing this is the environment we're in today.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point, and it gives me the opportunity to ask this question where we focused a lot on the financial risks, and naturally so, but we live in an environment where more and like the risk management approach is getting more and more integrated, right? There's lots of other types of risks, non-financial risks, which have cascade effects and could influence your financial outcomes. So you need to take those into account as well as you think about the future. So how do you, in your practice, like what's the approach that you take to identify those other risk types? For example, there's regulatory and compliance risks, which can drive financial outcomes, technology and cyber. All sorts of other risks. And so, like, is there any, but I would love to hear your perspective on that. We'll start with Allison.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to share thoughts on regulatory risk as a former recovering regulator. And
You never recover.
You never recover, yeah. Recovering auditor as well. But I think there's a couple important things here. One, you want to know your regulator well. You want to plan for a range of outcomes. And then you want to decide, based on the foundation of that knowledge, what risks you want to take. And I think that's the most fun part of this conversation. Lee and I were talking about this earlier, so I'll get there, but maybe just quickly hit on know your regulator. I think you need to go deeper than just knowing XYZ entity oversees you. They are all black boxes. They don't post org charts. They don't often post a lot of inside information, and so you want to do everything you can to learn what you can about your regulator. And then think about as there are leadership changes with administration changes, how is that going to affect what's coming out of said regulator? So as an example, I think the SEC, I've seen in the last 3 administrations very, very different chairs and leadership, and how that trickles down to the answers that you get from the staff. So you're not getting the same thing, for example, with Chair Atkins under Trump's second administration as you were getting under Trump's first administration. And so knowing your regulator, reading their statements, speeches, understanding the people behind the comments that you're receiving, as an example, is really critical to kind of building that foundational knowledge to know what risks you can take. And then planning for a range of outcomes. And I'll just maybe succinctly say, if you're a large institution, you probably have a whole team that does this and probably also advocates on your behalf to that regulator. If you're a small institution, then you're going to really have to lean on your counsel, and probably that ends up falling to the CFO or somebody in the finance organization, as well as potentially legal, depending on your regulator. And then the last piece, again, is using that foundation to then determine what risks are you willing to take. And I think you have to know your regulator and understand the range of outcomes in order to take the right risks for your business. And that could be very, very, there could be a big range of outcomes that you might want, but you got to decide what risks are you willing to take. I know, Lee, you're regulated more by the FDA than the SEC per se, but I think we talked about this morning, how aggressive do you want to be?
Yeah, and I would, pick up on it. It's, what Allison says, know your regulator. What's the motivation? So, are there new policies that are coming? And, maybe talk a little bit discreetly to my business. Are new things happening, with the MAHA movement that are widening things up? Are there things happening in the FDA that are tightening things up? So understanding the motivation for the people that are coming in, if you are in an environment that you're regulated, and focusing less about compliance on the financial reporting and accounting side. And just an example, real life, and the office of the CFO that I get involved with, or that I think is really important for us. We came out with a ashwagandha product, right? Ashwagandha, known for putting you into a chill state, overall. And I want to make sure we as a company want to sell as much as possible. We want to show the immediacy of how ashwagandha takes impact on you. But what you're not allowed to do is show somebody on a digital ad, put it in their mouth, and get into a chill state. So we did that copy. The legal team came back, and we end up having to reshoot it and show it in the front seat of a car rather than somebody taking it. And it's a real life example of how we think about it. And look, I'm not the one shooting. We're not the one in finance saying what we can do or can't do. But I bring it up because we need to be able to play in the gray of that regulatory area. It's a lot of things are black and white, and that's easy. That's where I think the panel, we talk about AI can do that. The things like Kyle said. But how do we play in the gray of regulatory is really important. And then are you going to get a slap on the wrist? Is it, as I mentioned before, going to harm your brand? Is it about, this is the fourth thing that this company has done? So I think understanding what the implication could be if things go wrong, and what the opportunity could be if things go right. I think I would add to what Allison had mentioned on her business.
Yeah, well, and maybe just to pull on that thread really, really quickly, playing in the gray is also, I'll give a boring example here, but for the public companies out there, it really relates to decisions you might make in financial reporting and accounting, and technical decisions. So, there are a multitude of things that the staff would love for you to consult on because they want to make the decision. But you often have to take the risk of making the decision yourself because there are so many gray areas of judgment there. Yeah.
So on that point then, any practical advice on, maybe let me ask it differently, how much upfront guidance are you able to get from your regulators when you get into those gray zones? Obviously that's important to make an informed decision. And if you are getting helpful guidance, like what's the practical advice around how to have that conversation?
Yeah, I think that the SEC tries to do a decent job of putting out a lot of guidance when it is a systemic issue. You're not going to find your nuanced issue. Often will get airtime, but you know, I do think that if it's affecting a lot of people in the industry, they'll try to put guidance out there. You can certainly go in, but I think that's where you have to weigh the risk of, like, what if we get the answer we don't want? Would you rather take the judgment yourself and see what they say?
Take
on
the
back
risk.
end? Right.
Yeah.
Take the risk.
Yeah, take the risk. Yeah.
Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, and the, comment I mentioned about, the motivation, so I think it's about looking outside, having the courage to speak to other companies, that could be competitor of yours in
That's
a
so
way, in a way that you're not, trading trade secrets, because practitioners want to have that language with one another, and that's where, I found that speaking to somebody in a similar position in a different company, most of the time, not all the time, would want to help and share some of their, insights. So look to the outside market practically. Don't be afraid to get involved with the trade association of maybe your practitioners or your peers, for that purpose. I think I've seen, work pretty well.
Next slide. I think we touched a lot on specific instances where you are engaging and shaping and helping inform the strategic direction, right, of the firm. And then I'm just curious how you are thinking about your initiative portfolio and specifically the allocation of time, right? So I think we touched on this before, that ideally you would want to be spending as much time as possible at the intersection of the places which give you the highest upside potential, but at the same time create the downside protection for the firm, right? You don't want to be kind of being tilted in too much on one direction or the other. Any mechanisms or kind of helpful tips for the audience here in terms of how do you keep that view balanced? Maybe we'll start. Allison.
Sure. Yeah. So I think you're asking about how do you think about initiatives that are both protective and opportunistic. I said I wasn't going to give this boring answer, but I'm going to start with it really quickly, which is that, I think the foundational activities that you do to build investor trust are a great example of activities that are both protective and opportunistic, right? It's a chance to communicate with your investors, but it's also a chance to show them that you have strong controls, you have strong financial reporting in place. So I think just blanketly, financial reporting is a good example. Another one we talked about, maybe less boring, is customer onboarding. And so in our business, when you think about customer onboarding, there's tons of risks. We have to go through a lot of AML, KYC activities to really know who we're interacting with. And that is to protect against risks, but it's also a benefit to our marketing team, because they get to know our customers a lot better through that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's one initiative that the Office of CFO has some control over that is critical to almost everything that Allison was just talking about, it's data governance. And data governance is going to protect us from that downside of having several versions of the truth. It's going to protect us from the downside of misreporting. But it's also going to give us upside, because we've already established that the Office of CFO is responsible for the accounting information. That's the core stuff we have to do. But if we're going to be accountable for that operational information, we need to have some say how that information is shared and how that data is governed within the enterprise. So we are in control of, or we can put controls around the durable information we control. But having a data governance policy and also a data governance system. So for instance, we know where the data for finance is going to come from. It should be coming from our ERP. It should be coming from financial systems. So the less hops that has to make to get to any kind of reporting, the better. So if we can get granular and have that single data model in finance, that's great. That's what we want to go for. And that's going to prevent us from having a separate version of truth. However, operations, we don't necessarily want to ingest all of operations' minuscule daily information. We need access to that. Oftentimes, they may put it in a place like Snowflake. So we need to be able to go out there, bring that in, and have that still be that single version of truth. So data governance really becomes that one thing that can do both mitigate our risk, but also improve our overall operations.
That's a really great point. We spoke a lot about identifying and finding the right set of initiatives, but we haven't really touched on a question which is maybe even more difficult than that, which is how do we discontinue the ones which are not delivering as expected, right? And how do we identify the things that we can turn off, right? It's kind of hard to beat the inertia sometimes. So I'm curious to hear from you if you have any advice to share on that front.
Yeah, so if you think about it, I mean, when you think about turning off an initiative, I think part of what's needed to be able to do that effectively and consistently is having the right framework for management in the first place. And I think you'd be honest about your evaluation of what you're doing so you can basically say, like, look, this doesn't make sense anymore. We have a really rigorous process, not only for forecasting, but also our monthly operating reviews. And part of that, those operating reviews go through the capital investments. And if they're not making sense at that point in time, you got to be honest about pulling back on that. But I think it also goes back to having really good data integrity. You have to understand what lever you're actually trying to improve upon to say whether or not it's effective. And then you have to be willing to spend the time on it. Because I think one of the other pieces sometimes is there's times where certain investments take longer than we think they're going to take. But you have to have courage to be able to continue that investment if you think the ultimate return is going to be there. So I think part of the risk reward we have to do in our role is understanding at what point you pull back. But you got to be courageous and say, look, that bet makes sense. Certainly in the realm of AI, you think about, I was mentioning pricing earlier, that's going to take time, right? That's not an overnight solution you're going to have. And I'm certain that in the coming quarters, it probably won't show that it's done anything. That isn't to say we need to pull back on that. It's most likely we need to make sure we can continue that path, because if we don't, we're going to be left behind. So I think it's a balance, and I think you got to have the right assessment behind it.
Absolutely. Any other?
Yeah, there's a framework that lead rubric. There's a framework or a rubric we put together that helps determine that, because it can't be just we think, it's got to be we think we know, at least going in. So doing our pre-mortem, to use that term again. And there's really 4 different areas we think about. There's one is, first of all, technical debt. What are we going to spend on this? If we're replacing an set of Excel spreadsheets for your forecast, it's going to cost more. Do we abandon it because it does? Or is that IT ecosystem is going to create, is that better than the IT ecosystem we would have to do otherwise? So that's the first thing, is technical debt. Then we're going to see, does it make the enterprise more efficient? Can we do these tasks quicker? Do I have people who are spending 80% of their time just creating spreadsheets? Can I flip that to where they're spending 80% of their time telling me what those outputs that used to be in those spreadsheets mean? That's valuable. That's something that's valuable. If it's not doing that, if it's not making us more efficient, maybe we need to think about, is this a project we want to continue? And it's not just post, it's also pre. And then the final 2 are really effectiveness, that ability to make better decisions quicker. And this can be nebulous, because the decisions you thought you wanted to make going in may not be the decisions that you're going to make going forward. Is it flexible enough to really flex with the business? And the final thing, and I think the purpose of what we're doing here, is it cannot increase our risk. It has to mitigate the risk. So if it doesn't really pass all 4 of those in some form of fashion from a potential return on investment, and then we can measure against that going forward, it may not be a project that we want to continue.
Yeah.
And then can I have one more thing, actually? So if you think about it, too, because at the end of what you said, so ROIC is a really important measurement. But I think one thing we got to hold ourselves accountable to as a group of CFOs often is, I see EBITDA all over the place. And we talk about EBITDA all the time. And it's a confusing notion to me on some levels, that's our framing constantly, because EBITDA excludes the capital we're spending. And I don't know how we, as a function, can say that's okay to assess our performance. So I encourage us to all think about ROIC and really think more about EBIT or op income as a measure, because I think we over-rely on EBITDA too often. And even though, yes, the sell side's comfortable with that, we shouldn't be comfortable with that, because we should make sure we're actually driving the right value for the business.
And then it's great that you are mentioning that obviously the measurement and the monitoring aspect is hugely important, right, to deliver this value. I'm just curious, what is the level at which you are measuring? How often, what's the discipline around that? Are you looking at things at the initiative level? Are you measuring more at the BU and division level? And then kind of how do you cascade that? Is there an approach that you can share with the group?
Yeah, I can start. I think there's levels. So in our operation, we have a large North American business and a European business. So we'll obviously look at it from a tops-down standpoint and get more broader of what are the hurdle rates I want to see, or what are the levels of margin I want to see there. But I think ultimately we have to be as deep as we can be to understand where we're really spending the money and really how we're actually driving the return. So I think that requires you to be in the weeds on really what the investments are. Because I think if you can't identify where the spend is going, where the capital is really going, it's not worth having the discussion about. So ultimately, it's got to be on the initiative level to really do that. And that can only happen when you're really talking about the details, which also means, too, you need to pull in more people into those discussions. I think sometimes people hesitate to have a broader group talking through assessments of programs and assets, but fundamentally, when you're doing business reviews, that's going to require the individuals who are actually spending the money to have those explanations, to have those discussions, as opposed to relying on too high-level top-down discussions.
Absolutely. Now, listen, being successful in terms of delivering on these initiatives, managing risk, it's a team sport, right? It involves significant amount of collaboration across the enterprise with the other leaders in the organization. And, everyone comes to it with different points of view, right? I was curious, if you have any examples on how do you approach that collaboration and in which areas, and if you have any advice with the group on how to build a healthy kind of approach to that, we'll start with.
Yeah, I like the term team sport. So it is a team sport, and whether you sit as a marketeer, you sit in sales, you sit in supply chain, everybody needs to know the risks. So how do I bring them in the tent a little bit earlier? Is around making sure that, noted a little bit earlier, when they bring initiatives in, have them think about the 360 around it. So don't have risk be an afterthought. Let it bring earlier. And also have them, from a leadership perspective, when I'm with my executive team, I'm not apologetic for talking about risk. It's about why do we do it, and really, getting some pull rather than, pushback from them. And, what Kyle said a little bit earlier around, you have to have the time to actually review and have the conversations about these things. They don't just happen, and they can't land on the CFO desk and then the CFO to fix it. So bring them in early, make sure they understand the macro level importance of it, and have them really be the ones to define and partner with them on, what are the things that they're thinking about, that could go right, and how do we make bigger? How do we, eliminate some of the things that might go wrong? But early intervention, I think, is really important.
Excellent point. Allison, anything?
Yeah, maybe just pull a different string there. I think, for me in my business, my relationships with my CTO, my GC, and my chief product officer are key, but that's because we're a tech company, asset manager, consumer facing. For Lee, that might look very, very different. So I think, one thing to remember is that there is no one size fits all for who you should be communicating with, but what is one size fits all is that relationships really matter. It's your ability to get alignment on the risk-based decisions that you're going to be making. So, and then maybe one piece of advice that I could add from my perspective, I joined a company where almost the entire remainder of the executive team had been there since its founding 10 years earlier. I always make the joke that I've missed the nuance of the first 10 chapters, and so you need to remember to fill me in. But if I could go back, I would focus even more time on building those bridges and building those relationships from the get-go, even more so than focusing on any early wins to prove myself. Because I think the early wins will come, but showing them that you think you get hired somewhere, of course they recognize that you're on their team. But sometimes it takes actually getting in the foxhole together and having that challenge to approach as a team for people to really believe it. And so I think the earlier you can focus on building those relationships, the better off you'll be.
Great. Do we have more time for more questions, or should we open it up? Yeah.
Kathy's running back to get the mic, so.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
We can hear. The room may not be able to hear you.
That's fine.
Yeah, that's true.
He
Right.
was first.
Thank you. Okay, so this is louder than I thought.
See, you could have done without it.
I could have done without. My question is mostly for Allison, just because of the industry that you're in, which others have characterized as maybe democratization of private markets.
Yeah.
And so among key relationships that you mentioned before, just a few minutes ago, I was just wondering, where do you see the relationship between your office of the CFO and that of your chief risk officer, and especially when you're thinking about top of the house risk appetite and quantitative and non-quantitative, financial and non-financial risks? Where is that ownership and the distinction between those two important functions? And second question, if I might. So you also cited a little bit earlier, 5-10 minutes ago, the duality of opportunity between risk management information and sort of business upside or business use of information like AML and KYC. There was a much more recent example about the private fund advisor rule, now defunct, and I was wondering if you could comment about that and how you approached it while it was still live, and where you saw the risk versus upside of the SEC's private fund advisor rule.
Okay, the first question. So first, this actually would be interesting for everyone to comment on. You probably think we're a bigger company than we are because we're only 200 people, so we don't have a chief risk officer. But risk management is handled collectively by, I would say, definitely CEO, COO, CFO, and our GC, and then bringing in the other departments and expertise when needed. So probably a very different model than you would expect. We all wear a lot of hats. Even our chief operating officer is also our chief investment officer. Yeah, it's a collectively managed, I would say, but would open it up to anybody else if you have anything to add on how you're structured.
Yeah, I think when you think about ERM too as a topic, I think ERM was such a hot topic post-financial crisis, and I think it's changed dramatically, right? So in the industrial space, to me, if you're waiting for an ERM type cycle to have that narrative, like you just completely missed it. So I think risk is really embedded in all our roles now, and certainly something that we contemplate and talk about weekly, if not daily. Right, and a lot of our, at the staff level, with my CEO, we're talking about it. It's predominating the staff call. Like that's a huge aspect of what we're talking about all the time.
Which was one of the objectives of having ERM.
Right, but the funny thing is, I think the notion of having the role as of facilitating that discussion has kind of gone away. I think it's been absorbed into effectively what the CFO does today.
It used to be.
Mission accomplished. So.
Well, it used to be.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, it used to be explicit. Now it's just implicit that the office of the CFO, this is part of what they do. It's not a separate thing. This is just part of it. And, what we see is more and more gets thrown on a CFO's plate and less gets taken off. And so a lot of stuff we talked about today to mitigate risk is as much about taking stuff off the plate. And when I talk about data governance, that's why we talk about data governance. If you're having to chase around versions of truth or do what GAAP refers to as re-reconciling information, that slows you down. You can't do the other stuff that's coming on your plate. So freeing up the office of CFO from being that data steward and really making them that strategic advisor so they can do stuff like that just implicitly, that's where, when I talk to folks, that's where I see the office of CFO going. And it's not because they want to be there, that's just expected.
Any thoughts on the PFA question?
Yeah, I don't know that there's much I want to say in front of probably press, but let's chat afterwards. I think the important thing there is, again, going back to know your regulator. We definitely we're evaluating that rule, but kind of knowing what was coming, I think is helpful to how much resources you dump into it.
We have time for one more quick question.
Hi. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. I imagine not getting paid from your customers is one of the risks you might be facing for whatever reason it may be, geopolitical reasons or bankruptcy. So I was wondering how much of your headspace it takes and how do you deal with it? Thank you.
Yeah, I can start. So, it's a great question. I think certainly in the environment we're in now, it's even more important for us to be thinking about credit and how it's established. So when you set up customers, certainly credit's a big thing to obviously contemplate. But in our business, I'll look at customer and I'll look at customer aging by type of customers on a weekly basis, and then we have an escalation process to ensure that we have enough eyes on it within the business. So it certainly takes up maybe more of my time than you might think, but I think part of that's a function of just the environment we're in now. And certainly as bankruptcies come, as they have this year, you have to be really ready for those. And the one thing I'd say too is you're evaluating credit and credit risk, the ability to use things like letters of credit, to me in this kind of environment is really critical, depending on what kind of risk you want to take on as an organization. And we've been able to utilize those at times, which really put us in a good position where we can still maintain relationships, but still ensure that from a balance sheet perspective, we feel really good about what we're doing.
I would just add quickly, know your customer. So the excitement, particularly in consumer goods, the excitement of landing a big order and having the order in hand, what's the ability, for your, customers cycle through that as a retailer, as an example. So, putting in the metrics, putting in the visibility, and it could be bi-weekly, it could be daily, based on the side of it. So, my simple answer is know your customer and know what and how they're making their money in order to pay you.
And if you want to be really unpopular, get it in your seller's incentives. That you need cash. You'll be really unpopular, but it'll be effective.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions from the audience?
So thank you all for being here for this panel. Big round of applause for the panelists. Thank you all. And if you have any questions, they'll be around. But we have the next AI do's and don'ts coming up, and we're going to do a very swift change for the room. If you're but please stick around for the next exciting session. And thank you, everyone, for being on this panel.